Hello, today we're going to talk about how to water, fertilize, pot, and provide lighting for your orchid in order to keep your orchid healthy and extend the life and blooming life of your orchid. We already discussed about what you have to do when it comes to watering your orchid and making sure that all of the water drains out in order to prevent rotting. Just remember what we discussed about drainage and ventilation, which are both important aspects for orchid care. You can water your orchids in two specific methods. The first way is to hold your orchid above one empty container and pour all of the water through the substrate. Make sure that all of the water drains out. The second method is to submerge your orchid in a container with water. Make sure that your substrate is completely wet and pull the orchid out in order to let all of the excess water drain out. This method is exceptionally useful if you're using mineral fertilizers, which you can dissolve in the water prior to submerging your orchid. One very common question we get from customers and viewers is how often you should water your orchid. Orchids do not have a specific routine. Just remember that orchids are unique plants and come from unique climates. There are tropical winters and tropical summers. They have seasons where it rains every day and seasons where rain is very seldom and few and far between. And they have seasons where everything dries out. So that's why orchids can and have adapted to survive short periods without water. Orchids have very rich and succulent leaves and roots where they can store water. And because of that, if you go away for 2 to 3 weeks and leave your orchid behind, for example, when you come back, chances are your orchid will still be alive and well. One of the worst things that can happen to your orchid is that it may lose turgor pressure in the leaves, and some of the leaves on the bottom can become yellow. And if you restore your natural and common routine when it comes to watering, the orchid will absorb the water again really quickly and regain its turgor pressure. Even the fact that the orchid has had a short period of time without water will in fact signal to the orchid that a change of season had occurred, and it can force your healthy orchids that don't have blooms to develop new blooming shoots. This is a very common trick which can cause your orchid to create blooms by imitating its natural tropical environment. Another thing that you can do if you wish to achieve this effect is to keep your orchid in a cold room, or a cool room rather, that is about 18 degrees Celsius for a couple of months in order to imitate that tropical winter, and then transfer to a warmer room, a room that's about 25 degrees Celsius. This can signal another change in season and bring your orchid to the blooming stage. Make sure you do not put it in a freezing room, so anything beneath 13 degrees Celsius is quite dangerous for the orchid. It is dangerous to overwater your orchid, especially if you grow your orchids inside a decorative container. An excessive level of water can obstruct the ventilation, and if the roots don't have enough contact with air, they will suffocate and start rotting. So the answer to how often you should water your orchid is quite simple. Before you water it again, touch the substrate with your hands, or just stick your finger into the substrate, and if it's dry, then you should water it, and if it's still moist, then leave it out to dry so that you do not overwater it. The frequency of how often you should water your orchid depends on many factors like humidity, temperature, and what media you use. When it's a little bit colder outside or on your windowsill, you have to water your orchid a little more seldom. When it is hotter, for example in the summer months, you have to water your orchids more often. Another common question is what water you should use to water your orchids. You can use tap water if you live in an area where the water is soft. However, you should let it sit out for a couple of hours in order to let the chlorine evaporate. So how do you determine if your water is soft? For example, if you boil water inside a kettle that you've poured in from the tap, you can check to see if there are any mineral deposits at the bottom of your kettle. So what I do is simply peer inside my kettle and see if I have any salt mineral deposits. In our area, we don't really have hard water, so the deposits are very minimal or none at all. If you live in an area where your tap water is hard, then you probably shouldn't use it to water your orchid. And the dangers of using hard water are that the salt in the water can affect the acidity of the media and distract osmosis while obstructing the absorption of important minerals like magnesium and calcium. I don't recommend using hard water, and if you do, make sure you change the media often. Instead, you should use rainwater or melted water or distilled water to water your orchids. Regarding melted water, for example, I often hear my customers talk about placing ice cubes around your orchid. This personally doesn't make sense to me because there is no snow or ice in tropical areas where orchids originate. Although I agree that melted water is good for orchids, you probably can avoid taking ice cubes from your freezer and putting them around the orchid, which can cause cold temperature shock. Even though we know that the critical temperature for your orchids is about below 13 degrees Celsius, you can use melted water for your orchids. But I just find this is a necessary process and a little bit risky. If you wish to use ice, then simply melt the ice cubes in a different container and bring them to your orchid when they have reached a room temperature. This is personally why I don't agree using ice cubes for watering your orchid. Now I just want to talk about mineral fertilizers. The flower industry has put a variety of mineral fertilizers on the market that come in different forms. Some common forms are powder or liquid. These are very mineral-rich fertilizers and are readily available in a variety of stores and are typically very tempting to use or rely upon given to how accessible they are and the sort of minerals they offer. So here I have some mineral fertilizer, and it's a powder fertilizer. So one thing I often do, just to satisfy my own curiosity, is read the label to see what kind of minerals they contain, and this one in particular contains nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and a number of microelements such as magnesium, copper, fer, zinc, and more. I wouldn't recommend mineral fertilizers for people without experience because it's often likely that you can overdose or overconcentrate the fertilizer, and it can be toxic to the orchids. It's better to use a source of organic fertilizer as Shanga moss, for example, or shredded leaves with dead decaying organic components such as moss. These things have naturally occurring dead decaying organic material in them. And there are no synthetic mineral fertilizers in nature, which is where orchids get their organic fertilizers from their surroundings. But if you do decide to use mineral fertilizers, you should carefully follow the instructions. In addition, I would just like to mention a few experiments conducted in multiple greenhouses. The results show that when growers use natural and phosphorus fertilizer, there's really no significant difference between that and the control group. Furthermore, the experiment with potassium, for example, may appear that the orchids with potassium enrichment appear healthy for a few months, producing a similar number of size and new leaves. But as soon as the flowers start to appear, the lower leaves on the orchid show deficiency of potassium. If the orchids are planted in bark, they do not receive potassium and eventually die. In nature, you can find potassium supplement in hardwood ashes, which are very rich in it. But if you're using Shanga moss, for example, and are constantly replacing it, you shouldn't need to use mineral fertilizers. I practically do not use any mineral fertilizers at all, as I find that it's very likely that perhaps I might overdose them or simply fail to provide the true natural imitation sustenance. And as you can see, my orchids look fairly healthy. Another common question is what pot you should use with your orchids. A common argument is that the pot should be clear, and I agree. Transparent pots have their pros and cons. Some pots are designed that way so that you can observe growth, and this is very good for beginners, especially when it comes to growing orchids. The roots can receive ultraviolet rays if they are transparent and participate in photosynthesis more readily. However, some cons include that when an orchid grows in transparent pots, the roots have a tendency to grow inside the pot because they participate in photosynthesis and they are trying to reach nutrition. This, of course, combined with reliance on mineral fertilizers, can create a sort of fake comfort where we think we are doing the right thing for our orchids, when in fact we are neglecting to imitate their natural state of being and their growth. And we are dumbfounded why our orchids do not look like the ones in perhaps nature themselves, or they don't look like the orchids we purchased in store. So when it comes to transparent pots and their pros, I do think that being able to see the roots is a very good perk for beginners. It allows you to understand the structure of the orchid and become more comfortable with it. But, however, when we receive our orchids from growers, we notice that the roots tend to be bundled up at the bottom of the pot. When roots are laying at the bottom, the probability of the orchid dying due to being overwatered and simply drowning inside the transparent pot is quite high. And, of course, additionally, the orchid does look unattractive in this basic transparent pot. So ultimately, consumers tend to hide them in decorative pots anyway, in order to make them more appealing and eye-catching. And even sometimes growers place their orchids inside of decorative pots while keeping the roots bundled up inside the tight, transparent pot. So what is the point of placing them in decorative pots and keeping the roots bundled up in the transparent pot? Well, it's not really necessary. Another con is that when roots are growing on the inside, the orchid doesn't develop enough air roots, which is really important to the development of the orchid. Here we are simply trying to imitate the orchid in its natural habitat. When the orchids are using parts of their roots and they're holding on to their host, for example, the media in the wild, air roots are likely to be spread out naturally. The more air roots an orchid has, the less likely it will die due to overwatering. Air roots do not let the orchid be overwatered, even if the entire pot is full of water, quite simply because the roots are peering out. So you can use a simple plastic pot with drain holes if you are interested in giving your orchid a better environment to thrive in. Also, I have noticed sooner or later an orchid in non-transparent pots will naturally have the roots grow outside of it. Orchids that grow in Shanga moss, for example, have its roots grow outside of the pot and are much likely to do this than orchids that are grown in bark media. The reason is that the structure and type of formulation of the moss allows ultraviolet rays to penetrate into the pot, and bark doesn't have this ability. The roots inside the substrate can partially participate in photosynthesis, which is another pro of using Shanga moss. Now I just want to talk quite briefly about lighting. As you know, lighting is very, very important. Lighting is what allows photosynthesis to occur and to nourish our plants. In my traveling, I have seen orchids in their natural tropical environment growing underneath trees and shaded areas, as well as right above a very brightly lit area. Having seen this, I realized that orchids in our homes are located very close to windows and on hot days you can get sunburns on its leaves. Here I have two examples for, as you can see, I have two orchids with sunburned spots on their leaves. It's not very dangerous when your orchids are burned by the sun, and as you can see, it just simply causes minor discoloration in the leaves. Just move your plants about a meter further from the window and leave it alone. The plants have a natural ability to regrow the leaves, although unfortunately the staining that has already occurred in the sunburn will not be reversible. If you have a naturally shaded window and perhaps a tree outside of your window, you can place your orchid there. You have to remember that in wintertime you have to have a good isolation on your windowsill in order to avoid drafts and cold air, which can kill the orchid. If the temperature drops below 13 degrees Celsius, it is very critical for the orchid, and cold air damage is unreversible. There is unfortunately no way to bring your orchid to life after that occurs. But do realize that there is some flexibility, and even if your orchids are sunburned due to bright, startling sunlight penetrating their leaves and staining them, there are ways that you can adjust and meet the needs of your orchid. Like I mentioned, keeping it in a shadier area on your windowsill, or simply moving it away from your windowsill on hot, bright, sunny days. So this is all I wish to mention regarding the watering routine, fertilization, potting, and lighting of your orchid. These are just some of the few essential elements that will help you create a healthy, happy, and rich environment for your orchid, whether you are simply a beginner, an aficionado, or someone that was gifted an orchid and just doesn't know how to keep it alive long enough. I really do hope these tips provide some sort of guideline for how to incorporate this information and synthesize it into something that is easy and accessible. Orchids aren't tremendously difficult to care for, but they do require a level of caution and affection when it comes to dealing with them. Remember to go ahead and do your own research if you aren't convinced, and to further your knowledge on the subject of orchids, or to simply, if you're lucky enough to travel, examine them in their natural habitat and make your own conclusions. So thank you kindly for watching, and I do hope to see you soon. Good luck.